button at the end over there. So 4 of us have started talking about how to include diversity in this predominantly white university as we started a committee called COWPOC, Committee of Women and People of Color. So it's COWPOC committee. So 4 of us all belong to this COWPOC committee, and our goals are to really appreciate and advocate for diversity inclusion in a predominantly white university. So I'm going to just quickly start. So this session describes and explains why diversity is needed in the nation, particularly in a traditionally rural, small town, higher education settings, such as the University of Wyoming. That, as you can see in our part of the region, in the rural, remote, small towns, you don't see a lot of diverse people. So I call that a diverse problem becomes our thinking problem. When you don't see that there are not too many diverse people around you, your thinking becomes very traditional and one way of thinking and looking at and viewing the world. So it is very urgent for us to think about how we can include diversity in this remote red state institution. So those are our rationales. And here our purposes are, I'm just going to skip over because 4 of us are going to talk about, we are trying to open up and make visible how people, as people of color, we are treated differently because race, the experiences of race hits differently to different people, to white folks, and non-white folks. So when I talk about others refers to anyone who is different in gender, ethnicity, culture, race. So basically, others we refer to non-whites. And then while we are sharing our experience to live the lives as a faculty of color in this institution, we're not trying to just talk about how sad and how miserable we are as women faculty of color, but we really want to hope and aim to move our actions forward and to promote more just society and institution and more just equity education is what we are really aiming for. So with all that, I'm not going to go over all the theoretical frameworks. We basically situate our stories in the theories of critical race theory. We also read something about the racial contract by Charles Mills, who says that this nation is based on the racial hierarchy, that the whites are on top and blacks at the bottom, and everything else is in between. So with that, we feel that as living and working, teaching and researching as women faculty of color in this university, we feel there are a lot of micro and macro level aggressions inflicted on us. And so there are issues of white ignorance. White people mostly think that racial issues is taken care of in the past. Why are you bringing these racial issues? It's just done. We are moving forward. So that's basically white ignorance, and there's a concept called white fragility, white ignorance, as well as the notion of there's new notions that are coming up about how white people are toward racism, discrimination, and prejudice issues, that they just basically do not want to talk about it and just kind of forget about it and consider that as a thing of the past. So I will move right on. The reason we want to, that this session is special, the reason this is special because as women faculty of color living in a predominantly white society, we have a special voice as we live this experience that white people can never understand. And that's why we have a special pain to discuss, and these voices need to be out in the open and to be heard. So with that, I will just start talking about my counter-narratives. We call that counter-narratives or counter-storytelling because we are talking back against the dominant white mainstream master narratives. So I'm going to start with my stories. I don't know if the microphones are working over there. So here, I am supposed to start my counter-narrative first. So the microphones are not working. So here we go. It's working? So I've lived in this kind of traditional, homogeneous, small-town, rural university settings about 9 years. And I am from Korea, and as I was 6, 7 years old, I recall that I want to go somewhere else in a different country, and I want to become a teacher first, and then I want to become a professor. And I did that. I came to the US, and I became a teacher. I served elementary education as a teacher for 13 years, and now I have been an elementary education professor 9 years. And one thing over 9 years I realized is this, that there's a demographic divide in the rural homogeneous settings. That is, for example, look at this statistics. In LA, there are 27% white people. In Denver, there are 53% white people. And in Charlotte, North Carolina, there are 45% white people. In Casper, there are 92% white people. Moscow, Idaho, 88%, and Laramie is about 85, 6, 7% as well. I'm not against that population or white people. It's this thing that I am wondering about. When you do not see diverse people and white people are just the main majority people, they don't feel the need to include diverse views and diverse peoples and cultures. They may do the cultural and food festivals occasionally, and that ends right there. So over time, as a professor, I just realized that in my teaching that 30 years of diverse research has informed us that people of color, especially African American and Asians, are harshly evaluated by our students, the white majority students. And I do experience that a lot as faculty of color. I have many low evaluations, and I just wonder that experience of race is really different to white folks and non-white folks. And I lived it, but my department leaders and college and institutional level leaders do not understand it. They may work so hard to show that I am not racist. Individually, I am not racist. That's a big thing they want to show. But does their concept about that I'm not a individual racist, but does that translate into institutional and structural neutrality? That is what I do not experience, because when I research about these race and education issues, what I am stuck with my research when I talk about race and education and publish these issues, my leaders in the College of Education, because I'm a elementary education professor, are saying, why are you racialize everything? How come you are saying that your student evaluation being low, how is that being racial? Why are you racializing everything? And also said, why a literacy faculty do and conduct research on race? Why shouldn't you do literacy about phonics, fluency, and spelling and vocabulary? Why do you have to make everything racial? From now on in the future, you should not racialize everything. That's what I was told. But I recall looking at my job description as elementary education professor, it does not specify that as a faculty of color in elementary education in literacy focus, I should be only looking at fluency, phonemic awareness and phonics alone, because in my mind, that's looking at literacy in a very narrow mindset. Because if you are looking at only phonics, vocabulary, fluency, then we are not looking at the real big picture that is racial differences, class differences. How are we going to explain that achievement gap if we do not look at the big social, institutional, larger society problems? That's what I always question that. So in my experiences as a professor of color, when I bring in these multicultural and global issues and social justice topics in literacy education, my students are saying the same thing like this. There is no need to bring in the racial and other social issues and problems in your classroom. Now, if the students are not having issues like diversity, because we don't see diversity in our college classrooms, perhaps past issues don't need to be examined. This is one of my students are saying. And so basically what I'm trying to say is my white students just somehow resent that and refuse the fact that they also have to think about to teach the minority students someday. But they think we don't see it, therefore we don't need it. And another thing about my teaching that administrators told me is that one time, this administrator said, Tao, you are a below average teacher. So I asked, why is that? And he said this, and he wrote this, that this administrator is saying, this model that Tao goes back, Tao is my name, Tao goes back to his Confucius beliefs. Yes, I am from Confucius beliefs and Confucius cultural heritage person. And he was saying that this is a model that she goes back to, and she was trained and educated more than half of her life. It is this reversion to the more traditional model that causes friction between Dr. Han and her white students. Students perceive her teaching as a lack of respect and trust, and this is evident in the qualitative course evaluation comments. And this administrator has not ever set his foot in my entire teaching, and that he looked at this student evaluation strictly and put that in my annual evaluation letter. And I felt compelled to go up to the dean, and I had a talk with the dean, and the dean is saying, if you have an issue with your department chair, you must follow the university procedures. So I feel what I feel over the years. I mean, I cannot share all the experience of 9 years, but these are a few excerpts. I feel that all people do, white people, I have nothing against white people. I love it. I love them. Mm-hmm. My husband is white, and I love him. I don't have issues with the white people, but when they do not have an understanding of what this means to have a faculty of color, and they can say, I don't have individual racism against her, but when transacting in daily businesses like this to me, they themselves are really ignorant about the diversity and how to deal with the people. So they claim that they are welcoming diversity. Uniregs, they talk about how they are inclusive, but these kinds of transactions do not translate into practices. And that is what I am really concerned as a faculty of color, because when things go slightly wrong, they don't ever check how could have gotten this far, but they never question the student levels, department levels, college levels, institutional levels. They never reflect and check back. Mm-hmm. It's always coming down, let's call Tao in, let her in. I'm called in constantly, and I'm going, it's all me. You are at fault. That just brings down to that level, and I feel, is that really me? Or is that the institutional and structural disadvantage that they inflict on us, and that micro and macro level aggression hurts. Over time it hurts, and what I am mostly worried about is when you, as a faculty of color, internalize that deficit mindset that they have on us. And thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I prefer to stand because I know I'm short. Thank you, Tao, for that wonderful story. As Tao mentioned earlier, we have our personal stories of women and people of color working in academia. I'm Dr. Cecilia Aragon. I'm the director of Latino and Latina Studies program here at the University of Wyoming. I'm in the Department of Theater and Dance, an associate professor. For many years in my life, I have lived in adversarial and contradicting spaces. My memories of cultural identity and racial injustices reach back to two experiences I had growing up. One, living in an impoverished community in Santa Fe, New Mexico, that borders with 5 American Indian reservations. And two, moving to Texas and living in urban and then isolated rural areas. My experience with covert racism, group acceptance and exclusion, and cross-cultural conflict has helped me to see the influence of environment, culture, politics, and history on identity formation and intergroup relations. It is from these conflictive experiences that I became interested in issues of diversity, inclusion, and equity. Throughout my life, I have pursued opportunities to build bridges between groups, close the gaps of social injustices, and participate in organizations that promote equality with disenfranchised and marginalized groups. One of my favorite theater feminist critic, Jill Dolan, in her performance manifesto states, "Writing for people interested in a feminist approach to theater and performance is a challenging task, since the constituency is large and varied from theoretical, political, and ideological perspectives. Any feminist endeavor in this area confronts the problem and the pleasures of diversity among its audiences." This quote serves as a departure point for me, given the contexts in which I have lived almost my entire life, that of a performance artist, a Chicana, a feminista, racial tensions, cultural pleasures and diversities, and mainly, predominantly, white audiences. The issues of race, class, gender, and sexuality are an integral part of my own ethnic cultural identity formation as a Chicana theater artist and critic and scholar and educator. All of this has informed my own experiences as a borderlands youth who faced coming-of-age paradoxes and conflicting ethnic legacies. In the 1997 article, The Good Red Road, Journeys of Homecoming in Native Women's Writings, Beth Brandt summarizes an understanding of how Indigenous women create a consciousness of being Indigenous. According to Brandt, there's this ancient cultural consciousness where the memory of history, of culture, of land, of nation is always present. It's like another being. She argues that this framework is manifestations and embodiment is for not just women's writings, but for all Indigenous creative work. Growing up in Santa Fe, New Mexico, I've been fortunate to have the opportunity to observe and participate in traditional ceremonies for many Indigenous cultures in the Southwest. Participating in powwows and chantings and spiritual blessings, the planning of traditional Navajo weddings. They all have led me to define what Brandt calls an ancient cultural consciousness. Not knowing these intricate social circles and structures of different tribal ceremonies, I engaged with Indigenous communities, sometimes as a tribal member, and other times as an outsider, an observer, a spectator, in part due to my father's Spanish heritage. From my own lived experiences of performing inherited roles in the Indo-Hispano folk dance and dramas of the Pueblo people of New Mexico, I performed in such dances of the corn dance, the matachin dances, zozobra in Santa Fe, los camanches, la pastorera, burning of the cucuy, Indita singing, La Promesas, and many, many other. I internalize and remain situated in transnational and transcultural narratives of Spanish conquest, geographical spaces, activism, and Indigenous performances. So this confluence of what I call the performing mestizaje was very evident in these formative childhood years, particularly with the variety of Indigenous ceremonies and public pageantries performed throughout New Mexico. The intersections of my lived experiences as a mestiza and my academic training in critical theory, critical race theory, and border theory give attention to this influential border studies scholars, such as the Chicana feminist writer Gloria Anzaldúa. Thus, being a mixed blood woman, I understand the theatricality of how both Hispano and Indigenous performances contribute to new ways of analyzing the performances of the mestizo people. In the repository of my collective memories with these dance and dramas and ceremonies lies this confluence of mythology, religious beliefs, colonization, captivity, chanting, stories of puberty, womanhood, survival, and spiritual forces of Indigenous traditional stories. As a mestiza child from a family with a long history of ancestors who lived in New Mexico for over 400 years, there occurred a trajectory in my father's career who worked in the restaurant business, which transported us away from New Mexico to Texas. My father received a business promotion with the company he was working for that forever changed the way I conceptualized my racial identity. He moved our family out of New Mexico and into a city in West Texas where there was this oil boom in the 1970s and 80s. In Texas, we first moved into an urban neighborhood known as Niggerville, an accepted term by the insiders and the outsiders. This was a place where both African American and Mexican families resided on the other side of town. This was my first encounter of the historical legacy of segregation in the South. It felt familiar in a way that it had remnants of what a reservation was like for Native Americans. And for a couple of years, we lived in Niggerville, and we accepted the way of life. Until my father bought a ranch-style home with 20 acres of land outside of the city limits, an economic status only afforded by the socioeconomic gains of my father stepping up the corporate ladder. So the countryside brought much tranquility of escaping these harsh inner city life and salient racism. However, country life had its own challenges. I attended a high school in a small rural town in West Texas, much like many rural towns in Wyoming. It was predominantly Anglo, where my family was snidely known as the Mexicans. From the point of view of the dominant culture, the phrase implied that we were the other, the subaltern, the wetbacks, los mojados, the farmhands, you know, the illegals from that south of the border. So an easily impressed teenager, I readily integrated into my mind a hegemonic image of a border crosser. However, my New Mexican family challenged the Anglo of the concept of the other, el mojado, los mojados. That is my family's worldview from the perspective of Ansaldua's borderlands theory, located our personal history within the history of a people with a resistant border consciousness. And that's what our parents taught us, to be resistant. We had a double consciousness. On the one hand, I was repeatedly confronted by a reductive Anglo view of the Southwest Mexican, and on the other, helped by my family's historical experiences, I contested the hegemonic view and affirmed my own cultural differences. From such a subject position, I continuously confronted and resolved cultural tensions, safe, unsafe spaces, them versus us, this side of town versus the other side of town. It also gave me comfort and discomfort in everyday human interaction. My sense of border crossing drew richly from my pre-conquest history, everyday storytelling, myths, and folk tales that were passed on by my antepasados. At the same time, during my coming of age, I also experienced another form of border crossing. Along the U.S.-Mexico frontier, in the company of my father, I would visit the Mexico border at Acuña, at Juarez, at Laredo, in Del Rio, in Matamoros. I witnessed Mexican families literally crossing the border. Once these families completed their dangerous journeys into the U.S., they would make a call to my father, who then would pick them up at the nearest and the local 7-Eleven store. My father would transport these families into Texas. We provided assistance to facilitate their successful crossing of physical and social spaces. We connected them with their family members in Texas, informing them about prospective jobs, encouraging them to enroll their children in educational institutions, and we helped them fill out their citizenship paperwork. This experience of helping others cross borders led me to discover my own historical borderlands identity as the new mestiza, a Chicana with a consciousness grounded in cultural and historical differences. In retrospect, I not only faced a cultural boundary with Anglos, but another one with Mexican nationals. In recognizing my double consciousness, Americanness, I was privileged and too gringa for the Mexicans, and not American enough for the Anglos. Such a borderlands paradox experience during my coming of age revealed to me my bicultural self as a resident of the US. As Chicano sociologist Jose David Saldivar describes, such an experience that is inherent as the transfrontera contact zone, where new realities surge daily and the everyday negotiation of an ethnic identity is inevitable. In my youth, I became dramatically conscious of my own existence as a border crosser, a state of mind that remains with me today and helps me get through many of my challenges. My adolescent experiences can also be theorized with anthropologist Renato Rosaldo's concept of political social indifferences. I understood then and now that I must constantly negotiate and renegotiate new relations with members of the dominant culture, as well as with newly immigrated Mexicans. That is my borderlands identity, the features that intersect race and class and gender and elements at the very center of who I am, a mestiza Chicana. Critical theorist Homi Bhabha, in his book, The Location of Culture, he states that in the clashes of culture with dominant society, inevitably racism will exist. He states, quote, that we find ourselves in the moment of transit, where space and time cross to produce complex figures of differences in identity, past and present, inside and outside, inclusion and exclusion, end of quote. From my childhood experiences, I developed a genealogy of the way humanity and race function. Racism tends to create a sense of disorientation, a disturbance of direction, a restlessness movement caught in the here and the there, in the all sides, on this side and the other side, the hither and the thither, the back and the forth. It is this disorientation that I continually feel being in Wyoming. At this point in my life, I embrace and I find comfort in traversing these liminal spaces of racial indifferences. What these lived experiences have taught me is to be an agent of social change, that social change that I saw my father participate in. I need to engage in constant interplay at various cultural frontiers and crossing points, whether it be on the Spanish land grant or on the native reservation or in Negreville or on the US-Mexico border, or whether it's on the academic institution. Similar border consciousness and border crossing are apparent in my work as I settle into my career in the predominantly white academic institution in Laramie. The same repeats of my historical trauma occur and reoccur more often than not. I've named these historical traumas the whiteouts. I've occurred many whiteouts here in Laramie, as many people often do in Wyoming. Metaphorically, it offers a place where I feel racism. I call it a whiteout. I offer this counter narrative to demonstrate my background of my own experiences with creating a consciousness of being indigenous and the other and the marginalized, as it highlights the central theme of how landscapes, collective memory, and how historical performance transmits the message of a racial and ethnic identity. According to Harvey Institute, Latino faculty, full-time faculty, represent only 2.9% of all U.S. faculty in academia. My position is to create my own personal pathway as well as to prepare a roadmap for other Latinos who aspire to enter academia. I tell my story, my counter-narrative, as a way to embrace all ethnic, racial identities, but also as a way to fight through racial injustices that I face every day. Thank you.
I'm Jacqueline Leonard. I think my mic is on. I'm just going to talk to you from here. I was born in St. Louis, Missouri, post-Brown versus Board, but experienced de facto segregation in public schools. However, I never knew I was going to a segregated school. I didn't know I was labeled as a black female of low economic status. No one ever told me that they expected me to perform less than other students in other areas, particularly in math. In fact, I thought I lived in a black world because every aspect of my life was around black people. Even the church I went to, which I later learned belonged to one of the whitest denominations in the U.S., was predominantly black because of segregation in the church, something that was known as the Central District, where all black churches of this denomination belonged. So my interactions were with other people that looked like me, including teachers, with the exception of the occasional white teacher who was primarily in the primary grades. Once I got out of third grade, practically all of my teachers were African American. I didn't even realize my minority status until I was a college student at Boston University. And as I walked down along the Charles River, down Bay State Road, in a year that the university wanted to attend to diversity and integrated the dorms, and heard a white male student say, "I have a Jap for a roommate." That was when I realized that I was part of another classification. It was even more internalized when I walked into an advanced chemistry class, which I tested into, and I was the only person of color in that class. Walking through the door and seeing that sea of whiteness changed my perception of who I was and my identity and where I belonged, and I did not feel that I belonged at Boston University. Even though I had made the grades, I had the SAT scores, I had even the grades academically in my courses. So after my freshman year, I actually dropped out of college. I did what I thought was culturally normative for me. I got married at a young age, I had children, and I didn't know what my future would look like outside of that. It wasn't until I was teaching Sunday school with my own daughter in the preschool class that I realized that I had a talent for teaching. I went back to school to become a teacher, and it was through teaching children of all kinds of backgrounds and seeing the institutionalized racism in the first job I had in Missouri, where there were actually two tracks of kids. There were kids in the regular classes. There were kids in the higher classes. And those kids never saw each other. They never communicated with each other, even at lunch. There was a school within a school. As a science teacher, I taught the higher level students, and they circled and had lunch only with each other. In an 80% minority district, 20% of white Jewish students never interacted with other black students. It wasn't until after I had continued my education and read Dr. Gloria Latson Billings' book on culturally responsive pedagogy and was a professor at Temple University that I realized the importance of that experience and of my own experience and how important it is for children of color to embrace their cultural heritage. And so that became the basis of my work, the work that I've brought here to Wyoming from having experienced urban environments in St. Louis, Boston, Philadelphia, Dallas, and then to be here and to bring that to the fore. It was amazing to me how the response of teachers in my classroom were, well, I don't have any black students in my class. Why should I be concerned about culture? But culture is not something that you don't have even though you may be of a different race. There's gender, there's religion, there's sexual orientation, there's race, there's language, there's location. When we look across all of those things, we all have a culture. Sometimes people view white culture as some kind of homogeny, when in fact, the very people that you may, in terms of your ancestry, are different. I learned through a DNA test that my daughter took a while, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, that I am 75% Yoruba, 25% Romanian, French, and Russian. I never knew that. But that difference, that cultural heritage that's a part of any African American family, we don't get to celebrate that. When we talk about race as black and brown and people of color, people want to know, why are we talking about race? If a white person were to talk about race, it would be accepted. But for me, as an African American faculty person at the University of Wyoming, if I talk about race, then I'm racializing, then I'm angry. I have been labeled the angry black woman. There's a narrative about black women that you're aggressive, that you're always trying to take over, that you don't know your place. And so instead of hearing what I have to say in terms of educating all children to be aware of their cultural heritage, what people hear is something other than what my intentions are. And so for someone to say that I don't have any black or brown children in my class, why should I be concerned about cultural responsive teaching? You don't know where that student in Wyoming is going to be 25 years from now, 20 years from now, 50 years from now. This is the 9th state in which I have lived. I had the experience of seeing some children perform just this week at Freedom School in Cheyenne on a research project that I have. And half of those students were diverse students of color. They told me about all the different states that they lived in because of the military background that their families have. And so children that live here in Wyoming may end up in Boston. How are they going to react if they've never had any experiences, if they feel as though it's taboo to talk about race? And so my experiences have been very marginalized. I've been isolated. I've been marginalized as the angry black woman. I just showed up. I didn't ask that I be perceived that way. Why is it that no matter what I say in a meeting, that it takes 4 other white people to confirm what I say as valid? I have 5 statistics courses from the University of Maryland, but yet the statistics that I want to talk about is questioned. I've written 50 articles, 2 books. I've been tenured at 3 institutions, but yet and my research is not viewed as something that's of value to this institution. Now that's changing a little bit. I actually had an interview for the UWIO magazine today, and I'm happy to report that after 4 years and $7 million, that I'm finally going to have something said about the work that I've done. Better late than never. Hallelujah. But as one of six tenured black female professors in mathematics education in the United States of America, I feel that it is important for me to nurture and to be a resource and a mentor for those that are coming behind me. I've done letters for promotion for 2 additional faculty that should be promoted to full professor this year. But that's appalling that there are only 6 full professors in my field in the entire country. My intent is to double that number by being the role model that I am and working to be the mentor that I am to others. And I hope that my experiences in Wyoming will become much more positive over time. Thank you.
What is it? It's all me.
You can either sit or stand.
I'm fine. I just stood in my last panel. Is everyone fine with me sitting? Did everyone sit?
Oh, no, I stood.
You stood?
Check here. Oh, okay, yeah.
No. Pull it closer? All right, all right. And I'll project. I'm a communication professor. I say project. I will project. Okay. So I'm sorry I missed some of my esteemed colleagues here in their panels, but I know what their papers, but I know what they're talking about, and it's all awesome. And I hope to follow well in their footsteps. And so I'm going to do something that's just a little more recent, but I will be focusing on my career trajectory here at UW, which I almost didn't have the career trajectory. So a stairwell conversation saved my career. A stairwell conversation saved my career. Like many women of color, I received no mentorship from my department chair. After a particularly confusing conversation with this person, I had just happened to run into an untenured African-American woman colleague in the stairwell who had been here at UW a few years longer than I had. She asked me how I was doing, and I told her about my conversation with my boss. And she pulled me into her office and said, "They're trying to make sure you get fired." She then spent 2 hours with me, helping me save my career and giving me strategies that I use and carry with me to this day. Since that time, over my 12 years at the University of Wyoming, where I made history as the first African American woman to be tenured and promoted in the university's history, 1886 to 2006, I have had colleagues write in my T&P packet that while I have numerous publications, they are mostly from black journals. So they are not sure of their merit in the communication field. I have had students from the student newspaper here at UW sit in on my classes to make sure that I was not discriminating against other white students in class. I had 2 white students who were failing my course threaten to shoot me when they pretended to make a gun out of their thumb and index finger, only later to claim it was a joke, with one student apologizing. I had white colleagues and staff tell me that I'm not really part of the department. And I had one faculty member tell me that I was not black enough and maybe I should go to Africa to, I guess, learn how to be black. According to Stuart Hall, power, it seems, has to be understood here not only in terms of economic exploitation and physical coercion, but also in broader cultural and symbolic terms, including power to represent someone or something in a certain way within a certain regime of representation. The regime of representation in the aforementioned context favor white supremacist hegemonies that have become played out on the person of color body, my body. The institutionalization of this marginalizing treatment allows hegemony to not only be widespread, but also appear natural and inevitable. Therefore, it is by its very nature creating, as Patricia Hill Collins so famously said, the outsider within. The culture of toxicity I have endured is not a white-only affair, but also includes women of color faculty who are capable of using institutionalized forms of oppression for their own gain. For example, I was told it's my job to go to the homes of my students who skip my class and see what it is I can do for them to bring them back into class. I didn't birth them. I am not their parent, and I am not their mammy. But this person chastised only me in this way. And as it relates to my position as program director and staff turnover, one woman of color reported that maybe staff leaving is a sign that I am just not that good of a department head. Of course, this faculty member gave no credence to the fact that the university did not allow me to pay a part-time staff a living wage. There is much presumed power given to faculty and lecturers, and lectures about faculty being polite to staff, but there is no avenue when staff or students abuse the power they hold. For example, one staff member who happened to be a woman of color told white students to avoid my classes because she said I didn't like white people. I don't know where she got that from. She's wrong. And more important, she had no evidence of this, but felt that she could say it. Another white staff member in front of a witness who has power on this campus, this staff member told me I was, quote, ugly, retarded, and stupid. And why couldn't I, quote, act like the good black person? Why can't you act like so-and-so? According to Louise Reyes and Halcone, they argued academia mirrors the same attitudes and generalities about cultural, race, and differences that plague larger society. Academia is an environment where faculty of color continue to report experiences of subtle and overt discrimination in the workplace. Based on this statement, I decided to look at my life for 1 month. And so for the last 30 days, from February to March, I decided to do a 30-day experiment of a life within me. And I experienced two significant events of racism and sexism that overshadows the daily microaggressions that I encounter. You know, when the students won't, refer to me as doctor or professor, but they'll refer to white colleagues with those titles. You know, it's not those that I looked at, but I looked at two of the most major ones, and this is what I'm going to talk about. A.C. Collins contended that at the intersection of race and gender stand women of color, torn by the lines of bias that currently divide white from non-white in our society and male from female. In the last month, these are my two significant racist and sexist terrains that I navigated. First, during a faculty meeting, a white male screamed at me for trying to make sure the classes that I teach were included as part of the curriculum revision. And second incident was a white male student said he doesn't want to work with me because I am, quote, too hard, and he, quote, doesn't feel like including any diversity in his research project. Patricia Hill Collins said that race, class, and gender may not be the most fundamental or important systems of oppression, but they have the most profound effect on women of color. And in the aforementioned cases in the last 30 days of my life, I'm affected. With the situation involving the faculty member yelling at me, this is most unusual because even though there was an apology after the fact, he never raised his voice to any white man or woman in the department that I had ever seen. All I was making sure was my classes were in the agenda for the fall semester. That's it. This unique behavior pattern was solely reserved and directed at me, the only African American in the department. In fact, all but one of the other participants in the meeting sat there quietly. I had to speak up for myself. I had to be cognizant of and use neutral tones and terms lest I look like the angry black woman, also known as the Sapphire. I was angry, but could not be loud, opinionated, or verbose. I had to be accommodating, listening, and reflecting. I had to be responsible for the power I truly do not have, since the racism and sexism came from and was being used by other social groups, in this case, a white man. The only person who spoke up was a white man who reiterated exactly what I said. And then suddenly the other person's tirade was done. After the meeting, however, when I was sitting alone in my office, some of those in the meeting trickled in to apologize for his behavior and for being too stunned and too shocked to say anything. With regard to the white male student and his research, he said my standards were too high and that he just wanted to finish his project. I told him standards are appropriate. This is academia. And he reiterated that he simply preferred to replace me with an easier professor, one that his committee agreed. And I told him that all of my students have standards and that they have high standards and that I treat all students equally, white or student of color. And he held firm and said, my committee, which is now all white because I was officially kicked off, agreed with him. Easier professor for the student was coded as white professors who would not make him work or include diverse issues in his project. As I reflected on the conversation, what became apparent was that it was not fair of me to hold white students to the same expectations that black people and other people of color are held to because the standards are different. Yes, they are. These are the standards that were created by white heterosexual men and women to further disenfranchise black people and other people of color. Thereby, according to this student, I cannot apply racist standards I'm held to white students because it's not fair, it's too hard. Yes, I have this rigor, and I've had to endure this rigor during my entire career in academia. This rigor has not gotten me a course teaching load reduction. I've had no course overload release, no research release, no teaching reduction. Rather, last week, the last day of March, I was questioned as to whether or not I'm teaching my full course load. My full course load is a 2-2. I taught 10 courses.
So I just want to just quickly So we are trying to conclude this session, and I want to say that in the US, we have made some significant advances in promoting egalitarian social practices that reduce prejudice and discrimination. But I still have to question that, does that mean that translates into a societal understanding and institutional and systematic practices? May have not, we may have not. I have to tell my leaders at the university, please know that experience of race is not the same for white folks and non-white folks. They do not ever understand this body, how this body experiences in a daily life, that they must understand that and try to reflect in their business transactions, in institutional policies and systematic practices that we really need to think about. To do that, COWPOC, Committee of Women and People of Color, suggests that we include diversity. We require a diversity course as a required course. And first of all, we need to hire more people of color, LGBTQ people, more in the position of power, so that they can represent us and different views. Because at the university, we only have 1% at the executive dean level. There's only one dean of color. Other peoples are mostly historically 99 to 100% white people only. That's why supremacy. If that is like that all the time, how do we bring in any diverse thinkings and perspectives? So these people of color, LGBTQ people, diverse views must be included by hiring more people of color and LGBTQ people in higher administrative positions. Thank you.
Our time is up, but if any of you have any questions or comments for us, we're more than happy to entertain that down off the platform in the audience.